history. I think she had one more course to finish up to get a master's degree in history. And she thought, she kind of went down the line and said, oh, Southern history, that looks good. I'll take that course.
No, I thought it was funny.
I thought it was funny.
Not good. I thought, what could that be?
Professor who was teaching that kind of funny, odd, humorous course was John Bowles. We've met a couple of times before. And as he tells the story, when she handed her first paper, he read it, it was very good, and he wrote back a little note that said, have you thought about getting a PhD? Here she was a lawyer, and she had a young family, and she was not working at that time, and so she did. It seemed less funny, I guess, at that point.
Yeah.
And her advisor and dissertation director was John. Her dissertation was a comparative study of the desegregation of major private universities in the South, which included Rice University. This dissertation will be published soon by the University of Georgia Press, and also won the prize in dissertation. She, as a sideline, has been doing some scholarly work here at Rice. Since graduation, she's been a postdoctoral research fellow at the School of Engineering, where she's working on scholarly history of science and engineering at Rice. She just finished the draft of the history of the Jones School of Business, and she started out in this writing of histories with one of continuing studies. So we're very pleased to have been associated with Melissa, and I think you're in for a real treat. She's going to talk about the history of Rice and desegregation of Rice.
Thank you. Okay. The reason that I know about the desegregation of Rice, as Mary said, is that it was part of my dissertation topic, which was a study that compared desegregation at 5 different private universities in the South. And they were the 5 that, after World War II, had aspirations to become major national universities, serious, high-ranked, prestigious research schools. So when I look at Rice tonight, one of the things that I'm thinking about, and that I have to talk to you about first, is the context. All right, all these schools developed in different ways, but they were all responding to the same sorts of post-war pressures that made them react. So what I'm really looking at is not exactly the desegregation of Rice. That is, I'm not really looking to see, who were the first black students here and what were their experiences, but rather, how did Rice come to make the decision to desegregate? And to answer that question, you've got to go all the way back to the late 1940s. If you look at it in this broader perspective of looking at all the major universities that I did, you see right away that Rice is absolutely and completely unique. In every aspect that I looked at, there were 4 schools that were more the same and 1 that was sticking out on the side. And Rice was almost always the one that was sticking out on the side. They do have one major thing in common. Okay, at every one of these schools, they wanted to become, the Harvard of the South. Sometimes they said they wanted to be the Princeton of the South, but you get the idea. Every one of them wanted to be that. Another thing that they have in common is when I went to do all the research at each one of these campuses, I would go around and go to the archivists and go talk to the history professors, talk to the alumni and faculty members who'd been around for a long time. They will all tell you very proudly that here at Emory and here at Tulane and here at Vanderbilt, we were never forced to desegregate like the public universities were. We didn't have any big scenes like they did at Alabama or Mississippi. The federal troops didn't come in. There were never any marshals sent here to order us to desegregate. We volunteered to desegregate. And this can only be described as Clinton-esque. It's definitely true. But it all depends on what your definition of is. It's extremely misleading. What happened over time is that their definition of force changes radically. In 1948, people at these schools, the trustees and alumni in particular, are exquisitely sensitive to any suggestion that the federal government is in any way coercing them to do anything. By the time this is all over, in the early 1960s, what they mean when they say we weren't forced is that they didn't come here with bayonets and make us do it. The fact is that the desegregation of Rice, as well as all these other schools, was accomplished by coercion. The coercion came from the federal government in various forms. It came from the northern philanthropies that these schools depended on heavily in order to make that leap that they wanted to make in national prestige. It was accomplished by the faculty, who voted with their feet. It was accomplished by professional academic associations, in particular the Association of American Law Schools began attempting to coerce these schools to open up as early as 1950. Students became restive. Alumni began withholding contributions. And with each successive administration in Washington, there was a new and more stringent non-discrimination clause in all federal contracts. So, yeah, it's true. They didn't come with bayonets, but they were forced to change. Now, the way this change took place played out differently at every one of these schools. While each one of them had its own unique vision of what its role was going to be in the community and in the region, they basically shared two main aspirations. All right, the first one I've already mentioned, that is they want to become prestigious national universities. The second one is that they want to be leaders of the southern region. They all talk about justification for their improvement as, leading the South out of the economic quagmire that it had been in really since the end of the Civil War. Now the problem is, before World War II, there was no particular conflict between these two goals. Right? Leading the region and becoming a prestigious national school weren't necessarily in tension with each other. Or if they were, it was subdued enough that it didn't make any real difference. The problem comes after the war. Okay? After the war, one of the things that the war changes is the availability of federal funds for the universities. There was really fairly limited federal research funding going on before World War II. But during the war, spurred mostly by defense needs, it's like someone opened up, the floodgates. And there was just a tremendous amount of money available, particularly for the sciences and engineering disciplines, but really all across the board. And this continued after the end of the war. So, the situation has fundamentally changed. Let's see, what was I going? Okay, so there's the possibility suddenly of not just sort of gradual improvement, but a huge jump. And large expansion in numbers of students. There's a building boom on campus at Rice. The number of buildings that goes up in the 1950s is just tremendous. The number of faculty is expanded, even at Rice, where there aren't the same economic pressures to expand the student body because there's no tuition. Even here, the number of students rises significantly after the war. But at the same time that there's this new opportunity, there's a problem in that segregation in the South begins to cause some difficulties with selling this. And that is largely because of the Cold War environment that settles in after World War II. This is an interesting thing, particularly in Houston, but it happens all across the South. There's a conflict between anti-communism in the rest of the country and anti-communism in the South. They're almost two different things. In the North and the Midwest, for example, one of the big concerns about segregation is that it will give the Russians a leg up on us in the Third World. You know, that they'll be able to point out that, oh, well, you see how America treats, you know, its minorities. That's why you should come and be on our side. And this was a real and significant concern. But in the South, the American way of life, to the people who were running these institutions, the administrators, the trustees, to them, the American way of life that we were protecting from the Soviet Union included segregation. And in their minds, any attempt to bring change to segregation could only be inspired by you know, some sellout to Joseph Stalin. And you see this in correspondence, more so at the other schools than at Rice. But when desegregation really gets started at Rice, when the lawsuit gets filed, there's a tremendous amount of correspondence that suggests exactly this, that this is communist-inspired attempt to upset our American institutions. Okay. Okay, so the context here is basically set. And Rice fits squarely in this whole development. I mean, it's much like the other schools in these broad ways. But specifically, Rice is different in many, many ways. It begins the post-war era in a position that is completely unique among its peers. For one thing, it was free. And it was the only one that was free. And this has all kinds of effects that ripple through the campus. First, as I mentioned earlier, there's a financial effect. You can't get more money by getting more students. You can't get more money by raising tuition. Secondly, there's a social aspect to it, and that is the Rice campus, unlike all these other campuses, is far more open. It's less dominated by the local elite. At Tulane, for example, or Vanderbilt, the local sort of commercial, social elite is in charge of this campus. Their children are running the campus organizations. The parents, the fathers, are on the board. The Greek organizations are dominant at these places, and that's just not the case here. So it has a very different feel to it. Now, the exception to this at Rice is the Board of Trustees, which is entirely drawn at this time from the upper echelons of Houston business and society. So there's a sort of a split between the students and faculty and the board in terms of sort of general social conservatism. Second thing is that, unlike all these other schools, Rice had plenty of money after the end of World War II. Many of the other schools were nearly broke. Rice had a kind of a rocky road during the Depression, but during the war, there were a number of things that happened here that put the school on pretty sound footing. There was a gift from William Marsh Rice's nephew that was very substantial. There was the acquisition of Louisiana lumber property, on which gas was later found. And above all, there was the Rincon oil field deal that was concluded during the war. And these things have one particular effect on Rice. And that is because they already had, what was at that time a lot of money, they weren't quite so driven as the other schools to seek outside sources of funding. Right? They didn't have quite the same dependence on, say, the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation as a place like Emory did, or a place like Tulane did. And secondly, for whatever reason, I'm not exactly sure, when they did seek research funding, it tended to be from local or regional businesses, Cameron Ironworks or the oil companies, rather than from national organizations. So that when the pressures started from the national funders to desegregate, it didn't hit Rice as hard as it hit the other places, although it hit them. Third, and this is really important, unlike all the other schools, Rice did not have any professional schools. These were the things that at Vanderbilt and Duke and Emory pulled the school into racial conflict very early. By 1948, 1949, on all these campuses, the law schools and the theology schools, where they had them, were just seed beds of pressure internally for change. That is, the divinity students and law students and the faculty of those schools began pushing from inside for change in an organized way, as well as, of course, the Association of American Law Schools was pushing from outside, and various national organizations of theology instructors were pushing from the outside. We don't have any of that at Rice. There's no medical school. There's no school of social work. We don't even have a sociology department, which in many cases was another area where pressure was built internally. So this was basically an engineering school at the time. And by and large, the faculty and students appeared fairly unaware of what was going on, or fairly uninterested. There is one major exception to this, though, and that was in 1948. There was a heated battle in the Thresher over desegregation. The guy who was the editor that year, and student newspapers are really interesting at all these schools on this topic because everything depends on who the editorial staff is. You look in one year, all they talk about is segregation, and then for 3 years in a row, there's not another word. Well, at Rice in 1948 and 49, the editor was a guy named Brady Tyson, who actually, his address is right behind mine. He was very interested in this problem and wrote a couple of editorials suggesting that Rice needed to get on the bandwagon here, that this was a wave that was coming and we would only hurt the school by not going ahead and beginning to make changes instead of waiting for somebody to make us do it. Well, it's remarkable what happened. Okay, remember, this school at the time has got maybe, 1,200 students, 1,500 students. Houston is not exactly, Paris, France. This winds up in the New York Times. The Thresher gets letters from Strom Thurmond, who's governor of South Carolina at the time. They get a letter from the Texas head of the NAACP. They get a letter from a guy named James Dombrowski, who was head of the Southern Conference Educational Fund, who was one of the most prominent liberal organizations in the South at the time. Letters come from Missouri, California. There's just letters. It's amazing. And it goes on. It goes on for months. Most of the letters, by the way, were supportive, although the ones that were not supportive were absolutely savage. They questioning Mr. Tyson's parentage and Some of the worst ones came from Houston, including one from a Houston high school principal who was really, it was kind of crackpot. So anyway, this goes on for months. I mean, and they print all these letters, and they print their replies, and it winds up in the Houston newspapers, and it goes on and on and on until finally, one day, William Houston, who was president of Rice at the time, decided that he had had enough. And so he wrote a letter to the Thresher. And I will read you this letter. I have concluded that some of the Thresher staff, as well as most of your correspondents, must be unaware of the provisions of the Rice Institute Charter. The Rice Institute was founded and chartered specifically for white students. The question on the admission of Negroes is therefore not one for administrative consideration, and the discussion in this connection is entirely academic. That's it. This letter winds up in the Sunday New York Times. And it brings the whole little tempest to an abrupt close. But although the discussion very quickly tailed off, the Texas Southern Herald, the TSU newspaper, finished it. The last published thing on this is an editorial in the TSU Harold that says, directed to President Houston, the students at Rice have not attempted to attack the legality of the situation, but rather its morality. This was not going to go away, and it didn't. Although, during the 1950s, things were very quiet at Rice. Now, on all these other campuses, this is a time of massive turmoil on this. I mean, it wasn't the first thing on the stove, but it was back there on the back burner, bubbling all the time. They had problems with scholarly meetings on campus, where there might be 2 or 3 black physicists going to come to the meeting, and what do we do? And or a black speaker might come to campus, and oh God, what will we do? Well, this doesn't happen here. For all those reasons that Rice was different, this doesn't happen here.